Picture this. You're 5 minutes into a class discussion, and a student keeps just citing a social media influencer as their source. So what do? Welcome to Off Syllabus with Manny, where we talk about the hardest parts of teaching, the ones that do not make it to the syllabus. Today, we are digging into misinformation. Joining me is Deeke, assistant professor and undergraduate teaching and learning librarian. Alex is here to help us explore how to build classroom experiences around information literacy and truth-seeking with empathy. So let's dive in. I feel like with social media and the expansion of it, like it's on our phones, like at all times, right? And that's what students are looking at every moment, every day, every minute. So misinformation is basically seeping like in everything, every conversation these days. So in your experience as teaching and also as a librarian, where do you see like misinformation showing up the most? Focusing mostly on like student work.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yeah, so what we see information or misinformation oftentimes is like unintentional use of it. So kind of like what you were saying, where they're getting information from social media, but really it oftentimes comes down to a lack of awareness around misinformation, right? Students aren't necessarily aware of their own information ecosystems or filter bubbles that they're kind of living in. And this might happen more likely, is that they just aren't taking a critical approach to evaluating the information that they're finding. We also are seeing, and we know that students are still citing fake citations from that are generated from AI, which is another aspect that comes in, as well as misrepresenting information based on like an AI summary, right? So AI summarizes an article, and that summary isn't exactly correct, and so students are just using that almost on face value. And so those are kind of like things we're starting to see with misinformation.
Yeah, I have a question about misinformation in general. Like, so we often feel, and I will feel about this when I was teaching and people plagiarize. Like I feel like they're just lazy. Do you feel like misinformation comes from laziness, or are there any other sources that that is making students rely on misinformation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there's a difference between like plagiarism and misinformation, right? So like the plagiarism could be maybe they're lazy or they ran out of time and things like that. The misinformation is a little bit trickier because I think it comes from a combination of there's so much information out there now, they don't even have the skills necessarily, like how do you filter what these differences are. We also have seen things, we call it the flattening of sources sometimes. So every source looks identical online. Like you don't necessarily, if you're not looking closely at something, you can't necessarily tell when something, oh, that was a newspaper article, or oh, that was a blog post, or that was a peer-reviewed article. And so when you don't have those critical thinking skills, right, you're not necessarily, I don't want to say questioning every source you see, but you're like, oh, what is this exactly on everything? It leads to a higher rate of misinformation, or that like you might take something at face value when you maybe shouldn't be taking it at face value, or you're using it in ways that are, I'll call it inappropriate, or like, oh, that actually isn't the way you should be using that source. There's some questions with that source.
Yeah, and that also makes sense because, like, so I'm gonna picture and maybe stereotype a little bit, but like freshman students, like depending on where you come from, like your socioeconomic background, you might have exposure to different venues of news. So you might not know how something looks like accurate or not accurate. They have never seen this type of like deliverable before, so they might be confused about that. So I appreciate like you highlighting this. So misinformation, I don't think everybody thinks of something good about it.
Yep.
So how do you think misinformation becomes a barrier to have productive or inclusive dialogues in the classroom?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So from my perspective, the barrier that misinformation brings to like productive dialogue, right, or debate, is it really distorts the information ecosystem around a topic or a controversial issue of some kind. So for instance, like if a person only stays in their own information bubble or information ecosystem, that they're only seeing that like that information only reinforces their pre-existing beliefs or are only looking for sources that back up their side of the issue. What starts to happen is twofold. One, they start to take all that information at face value, right? They don't critically look at their own side of things that makes them susceptible to misinformation, right? Or maybe something slightly misleading, or maybe they didn't quite get their, their facts right on their own side. But on the flip side, it also makes it hard for you to understand that there might be a valid point on the other side of an issue, right? There might be different perspectives, and you just can't see that because you're not seeing that information anymore. This then, all that in turn, when you're having a dialogue, to make it really hard to find that like one common ground with something, right? Sometimes there are facts that everyone can agree on. We might disagree on how they're applied, but they are facts that are there. But it also makes it hard to develop a substantial argument in support of your own side, right? So you want to be able to have that argument in a way that is substantial, that is well based in facts and information. But if you're only seeing one side of things, or only like, and maybe you're seeing misinformation on accident, it really starts to reduce that ability to do dialogue.
Yeah. So I personally had the concern that, and I don't think it's my concern, I think it's just a reality that misinformation is not going anywhere and it's just gonna get worse. Like more outlets are gonna be produced. The more we get exposed to like things like TikTok and influencers, like we just get used to seeing them, so we believe that they're more legit than what they might be. So misinformation is a thing and it's not going away. Are there any opportunities that we can leverage to use misinformation as an opportunity for learning?
Yes, right off the bat, I'll say yes. I agree. Like we don't want misinformation, right? Like that's not a good thing. However, the fact that you have to tell someone like be wary of misinformation or there are like fake citations, like it's a very odd thing to tell somebody, but because it automatically makes them think about like, well, what do you mean misinformation? Or like, what is the information I'm looking at? Is that misinformation? And so that idea that, hey, we even have to think deeper about the information that we're looking at can lead to more savvy information or media literacy skills, habits, and awareness. So well, I agree. Yeah, we don't want misinformation. The fact that we have to talk about it, I do think has an opening for us to really start to explore, help students learn more about the information ecosystem, more than we maybe had to in the past. Now with some of these issues.
Yeah, and we have been talking like sort of like high level, like this is misinformation, and this is how it influences student learning or could influence the way you teach. But going more into like the practical aspect of this. So do you have any approaches that you have found that are useful to help students sort out facts or interpretations or opinions? So like trying to get them to really think and understand their sources before they use them into a conversation or a discussion in class.
Yes, yeah. So I have a couple. Yeah. That's a great one. Yeah, no. So when I teach, yeah. So there are a couple of things that I do, as well as librarians in general will do. One approach is teaching students not only how to expand their information ecosystem, but also like what are they going to encounter, right? And I think your point earlier of some students may not be aware of different types of news. Maybe they only, depending on their background. So part of what we do is not only say, okay, well, here's where you can find different types of information, right? How do you access it, discover different, that way you're seeing multiple perspectives, but also understand what the purpose, goals, and aims of different types of sources are, right? There's a big difference between like an op-ed versus a political speech versus a breaking news source versus a peer-reviewed article on what they're trying to do, right? And like, so part of what we do is like, okay, not only do you open it up, but like, here's what you will see, and you need to be aware of that, so that way you can use that information in an appropriate way. Yeah, so there's a lot of that part that comes in not only expanding, but also like evaluating. And I think that's the second thing that I do a lot of is encourage students to use those like critical thinking skills and pretty much any source they find, particularly around authority of an author, of a source, or even as well as like the bias they might bring. I say this to folks that librarians are generally loath to say that a source is good or bad. Like we don't generally like doing that, right? Because it depends on context. But we do highly encourage people to think about like, okay, what makes the source credible? What perspective does this bring compared to this source? And we're gonna give you free access to all of that, right? Or we're gonna say it's fine, but we're not gonna tell you how to use it necessarily, but we want to think very carefully about it. So those are two big ones. There's a third thing I'll mention too for those who are if you're really struggling with misinformation in a class, or like how do you approach it, there's a model out there called SIFT. So it's developed by Mike Caulfield. It's very similar to lateral reading. However, it's designed particularly for misinformation. And so it's an acronym for, so it's S for stop. So like when you read something, like be aware of the emotional response you might get, and like, why are you having that, right? Or like, what do you know about that topic already? And like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
The I's for investigate. So this is where you look up like who the author is, what's their background, is there bias, what's their authority on a topic. F is to find better coverage. So the idea that you might want to see like, oh, is there any other sources talking about this topic, right? Or using potentially a fact-checking website on things. And then the last one is for T is trace claims, or trace like the source that they're citing. This is actually really big if you see like, say, a news source cites a research article. Read the research article also. Like make sure they're representing it correctly and not just cherry picking what there is. So that's kind of like a nice framework for anyone who's teaching, like, hey, you can use this model to help your students think about the way they approach information.
Yeah. So how about follow-up question to this? It's something that I think about a lot in my role. And it's like, so when we're trying to help people find like reliable sources, we sometimes rely on like well-known journals, but like to be able to publish in these things, like you have to have some sort of level of privilege and power to get to those things. Like not everybody has the financials or the connections to not have a better word for that, to be able to publish in this thing. So then other voices might be silenced if we only focus on like how great the impact factor of the journal, right? But then other venues where they will publish might not seem as reliable, even though they might represent their experiences very accurate. So how do you balance like the renounce of something versus the looking at actually just the quality of it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. That's something we talk about a lot actually when we teach as librarians, is that balance of, what is like, and sometimes it's framed as like, hey, a peer-reviewed article is good, but there are other sources out there. Like it doesn't get the full experience. And so the way I teach is, for example, in some of the classes I do, so we talk about like what makes a source authoritative, right? And so I'll actually ask students like, hey, who's been to an Illinois sporting event this year? And I usually teach first year students. So like 2/3 of the class raise their hand. They've been to a football game, they've been to a volleyball game, right? And then I say, okay, if you've gone to that game, let's say you had a great time, Illinois football won and stuff like that, and you wrote about it later, you would have just as much credibility, if not potentially more, than someone who watched it on TV or just saw the highlights of the game, right? And so it helps students understand that experience can be really important as well, on top of credentials, but also this idea of your experience, lived experience, can really bring some credibility to a topic. Now, I also bring in misinformation there as well, in that I say, okay, now let's take that example further. Let's say someone's writing a paper on college football, right? And they take your piece about how great Illinois was in being the fans and stuff like that, and they only cite that article and nothing else. And they write their article making it sound like, college football is the Illinois experience. Illinois is the best in the country. And I said, would that be fair? And they'd be like, no, that's super biased, right? That's like one perspective. I said, yes. So you need to bring in other perspectives, maybe an Indiana game, maybe Ohio State, whatever. But the idea is to help them situate themselves and understanding like bias isn't bad, but you have to be careful how you use it or your perspective, along with the fact that they have credibility as well from that lived experience beyond just, oh, I have a PhD from Harvard, right? Like there are different ways that you can bring that in.
Yeah, and it sounds like going back to something you mentioned before, it's all about context. It's about the goals of the assignment, what the instructor wants to get out of the assignment, and what the students want to learn from what they're reading. So everything will have their value. It depends on what you want to highlight.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So let's say I'm like, okay, I'm sold. I like what Alex is saying. I want to do this, but I really don't know how to start any of this. So in your experience, what are the best ways that faculty can lean into the library or the library resources to get support for them to start navigating information or misinformation in their classes?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So the biggest thing I always tell folks is that I think most faculty underestimate how much information we actually have at the library, as well as how our expertise can both make their lives easier as faculty in the teaching process and contribute to that learning environment. So the three things the biggest thing is contact the library, right? Contact your subject librarian. You can email me as well. That's perfectly fine. I'll get you to the right spot. But there are three things that we can really do that we do well. One is that we can help you find information sources that will help your students learn, right? So for instance, we have a source called CQ Researcher that actually shows both sides of controversies or issues. It's really robust. It helps students kind of expand their idea of like, oh, what's going on with this topic? So that's just a little example. There's hundreds more. Along with that, we can help contribute to assignment design. We actually have a unique perspective. We see students while they're working on the assignments. So sometimes we know if like, oh, that information source doesn't exist, or like you have to go to a public, there's these things that we can help you with of like how to navigate the information that you might want students to go with. Is it doable? What are the things you have to teach them in order to do this, and just help with that assignment design itself. The last part is that we teach students also. So you can bring us into your class to help you teach students about information. And when we do that, we aren't just teaching like, here's what the library is, here's how you find a database, and here's how you click on stuff. We actually also teach how you think about information. So we help students approach what are the positive things? What are the considerations or questions or potential negative parts about different types of information? So it's not just like point and click, but it's also like changing your mindset around it is something that we can bring to class.
Yeah. So I like this. So like you could help with assignment design, but also to create resources for students to use. So actually, let's say I have this gigantic lecture and I lecture in my class, it's 600 students, but I would need help with like actually my TAs, which are the ones who engage in these conversations. Would that also be something you guys can help with?
Yes. And I actually think that's an area that would be really great for the library to expand in, and for faculty as well, because a lot of times we have TAs, you're right, where they're the ones who are doing those conversations, but they're also sometimes new to the university, so they don't always know all the things the library has here. And so inviting us even to, I've gone to team meetings for some of our classes where, like you said, there's 10 TAs in the class. I'll go sit down with them first and say, okay, here's all the things we have. Here's how you prepare for this and stuff like that. And to build on what you said, not only can we help with that assignment design, we can build resources on our end to help your students get to those things easier, right? So we can build resources, we can make sure we customize things for your classes so those 600 students don't have to like wander through the wilderness, but like, oh, here, if we go here, and to kind of speed up that process for them as well.
So thank you. That sounds fantastic. And as we wrap up with this conversation, do you have one like practical tool or advice for faculty or TAs, now that we are including TAs in this conversation, for navigating misinformation in the classroom?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is really try to design assignments or activities that help expand students' information ecosystems, and require them to apply critical thinking skills to any sources they find in a way that's like, as part of like an assignment or an activity. You can use the SIFT method, you talk to us, but really we want them to help, expand their thinking, their bias, get past their own biases a little bit. Because we don't want to teach them like how to think, but we want to raise their awareness on how to approach information. And again, you can contact a librarian. We'll help you with that. You're not by yourself. We can help you with this process as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Huge thank you, Alex, for joining us today and talking to us about how to navigate misinformation, which is something like, as we said, is a challenge, but it also provides some opportunities to really help people develop these critical thinking skills and information literacy, which is important, especially in this current climate where it's an excess of information or access to information. Maybe not good information, but there's a lot of information out there, and we need to learn how to navigate that. So for more resources, check the links below, and remember that teaching goes beyond what's on the syllabus. So thank you.
Thank you, Manny.